The next day Will set off for the trap line, confident that this time nothing would go wrong. He reached the first trap with no difficulty, and after a quick drink from the stream he started off again, hoping that he'd find at least one rabbit to make his walk worth the effort. As he approached the 12th trap, he saw that the door had fallen shut. He ran the last few steps and picked up the small wooden box. But what next? He had been too far behind to see how his uncle removed the animals from the traps and how he killed them. He must have wrung their necks, since there hadn't been any blood. Will had shot squirrels and rabbits, but he'd never killed anything with his bare hands. Gritting his teeth, he pulled the trap door open. The rabbit filled the narrow box, its flanks heaving in terror. Holding his breath, Will reached in, grabbed it, and pulled it out. He felt the animal's muscles tense under the soft fur, and in a flash the trap was on the ground, the rabbit was gone, and Will's forearm was dripping blood from long rows of deep, curved scratches. He was stunned. How had it all happened so fast? The cold water of the stream eased the pain in his arm, and the bleeding stopped. Glumly, Will reset the trap, noting that the green apple bait hadn't even been nibbled on. Only the pain in his arm and the emptiness of his stomach kept him from feeling sorry for the terrified animal that had been in the box. On the way home, Will's arm began to throb. He could imagine what his uncle would say when he found out what had happened. "You're supposed to get the rabbit, not to let him get you." Or maybe, "If you want something done right, I guess you have to do it yourself." Why had he been so careless? If it weren't for those claw marks, he could have pretended that all the traps had been empty again. And then he could have asked his uncle casually what he should do when he found a rabbit in one of the traps. Why hadn't he thought to ask him that before he left this morning? Aunt Ella and Meg were hoeing the garden when Will got back. Taking a deep breath, he called, "I've hurt my arm a little. Can you bandage it for me, Aunt Ella?" His aunt hurried over. "That needs more than a bandage, young man," she said. "Come on back to the house with me." After she'd carefully washed her hands, Aunt Ella reached for a can on the mantel. "A little coal oil on that will keep it from getting infected." Coal oil? Why, that was kerosene. Will braced himself for the searing burn. "That must smart right bad," Aunt Ella said sympathetically as she tore strips of clean white cloth. "I'm sorry you got hurt, Will," Meg said, coming in to watch her mother bandage Will's arm. "I'm just sorry there won't be rabbit stew for dinner," he said through clenched teeth. "We'll have rabbit stew anyway," Meg said smugly. Will looked up, puzzled. "When I went out to the garden this morning, there was a big old rabbit eating the beet tops, so I threw a rock at him. Well, it hit him, and while he was stunned, I ran over and killed him with my hoe," Meg said triumphantly. Then she added, "Ma skinned and cleaned him, 'cause Pa had gone to the store to see if there was a letter from the twins." Will felt the blood rush to his face. Here he'd walked a couple of miles and come back with nothing to show for it but some gashes on his arm, and she'd gone out to the garden and killed herself a rabbit, accidentally. "Was there a letter?" he asked at last. Meg sighed. "Not yet." At dinner time, Uncle Jed looked at Will's bandaged arm and frowned. "You get kicked by that rabbit this morning?" Will nodded without raising his eyes. "I blame myself for that. I should have made sure you knew how to get them out of the trap. Those scratches can really hurt." Surprised, Will looked up. "You've been scratched?" "Sure have. When I was about your age. I walked my older brother's trap line for him. Came back all bloody with no rabbit. At least you didn't lose your rabbit." Uncle Jed passed Will a plate of stew, and the boy waited for Meg to pipe up with her story. But she didn't say a word. "Well, I lost my rabbit too," Will finally admitted. "This is Meg's rabbit." Then he forced himself to say, Tell your pa how you got it, Meg." Uncle Jed grinned appreciatively as he listened to Meg tell how she'd killed the rabbit in the garden. "Good for you, Meg, good for you," he said when she'd finished. Then he turned to Will. "Well, since we can't count on that happening again any time soon, let me tell you how to get a rabbit out of the trap. You grab the hind legs and jerk him out, and then you whop him on the back of the neck like this," he said, making a chopping motion with the side of his palm. "Pull him out by the legs and whop him on the back of his neck," Will repeated. But thinking of the warm, furry creature he'd held that morning, he wondered if knowing what to do would make it any easier to kill the next rabbit. A few days later, Will brought back 2 rabbits from the trap line. After they had been skinned and cleaned, Aunt Ella set one aside and wrapped the other in a cloth. "Meg, I want you to take this over to Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins. I'll bet they haven't tasted meat since the old man lost his leg in January." "You're going to send it to Mr. Jenkins?" Meg asked in disbelief. Slipping the neatly wrapped package into an empty flour sack, Aunt Ella handed it to her daughter. "This is as good a way as any to let him know we don't harbor any bitterness," she said. "Can't Will take it instead?" Seeing the misery on her daughter's face, Aunt Ella relented. "Very well, but you'll have to show him the way." Will slung the sack over his shoulder, and the 2 of them set off. They headed south, past the buckwheat field, and then through the orchard and into the second-growth woods beyond. "Why don't you want to see Mr. Jenkins?" Will asked. "Well, his 2 youngest sons were killed in the war," Meg explained, "and last fall, when Pa and I were down at the store, Mr. Jenkins said he didn't think it was fair for young men to die protecting the rights of people who wouldn't fight for themselves." Will said nothing. He felt the same way. Meg went on. "Pa said he agreed with him and asked who he had in mind. Well, Mr. Jenkins said he had in mind a neighbor who always hid in the woods when the conscription teams came through looking for recruits. So Pa said he always made a point of going hunting under those circumstances, but he was sure Mr. Jenkins didn't mean him, 'cause if any of his rights needed protecting, he'd protect them himself. Well, finally Mr. Jenkins got so angry he challenged Pa to step outside the store and fight him. Pa didn't want to fight an old man, so he said he had no quarrel with him and turned around to leave. And then Mr. Jenkins called him a coward." Will whistled through his teeth. "What happened then?" Pa turned around and walked right up to Mr. Jenkins and took hold of the front of his shirt and yanked him up so only the tips of his toes were still on the ground. He held him there, just held him there, so their faces were about 6 inches apart. Then he said, "Jonas Jenkins, who do you think is the coward? A man who walks away from a fight he knows he can win, or a man who makes a challenge he knows won't be accepted?" "And was that the end of it?" asked Will, unwilling to acknowledge the respect he was feeling for his uncle. Meg nodded. "Except that Mr. Jenkins hasn't spoken to any of us since. I think your ma's doing the right thing, sending him and his wife the extra meat," Will said, shifting the sack to his other shoulder. "I know, but I'm awful glad I don't have to take it up to the house." They came out of the woods into a long-neglected field that was dotted with small cedars. Beyond it, Will could see the glint of a tin roof. "There's the house," said Meg, pointing. "Give a holler when you get to the fence. I'll wait for you here." While he was still a distance away, Will saw an old woman come out of the lean-to that ran the width of the house. He stopped and shouted, "Hello! Hello!" The woman turned in his direction and shaded her eyes with her hand. "Who's there?" she called. For a moment or two, Will was uncertain how to respond. Then he held up the sack and started walking toward her, calling back, "I'm bringing you a rabbit for your dinner. I'm Ella Jones's nephew, Will Page." They met at the back gate. "Well, I'm pleased to meet you, Will Page, and I'm right glad for the meat you brought. Who's there? Who's out there?" came a loud, peevish voice. Mrs. Jenkins called back, "It's a young man bringing us a rabbit." "Well, send him around here so I can see him." Mrs. Jenkins led the way around to the front of the house. A frail-looking old man with a quilt thrown across his lap sat in a rocking chair on the porch. He leaned forward and squinted at Will. "Who is this boy?" he asked his wife. "It's nobody I've seen before." Will climbed the porch steps. "I'm Will Page. I'm from Winchester, but my father was killed in the war, so I've come to live with my Aunt Ella." "Ella Jones?" the man asked, his eyes narrowing. Will nodded. "She sent you this rabbit for your dinner," he said, thrusting the sack toward him. "Rabbit, eh?" he said. Then turning to his wife, he snapped, "Well, you'd better start it cooking if it's going to be ready by noon." She took the sack and started for the kitchen, and the old man turned his attention back to Will. "So you're Jed Jones's nephew," he said, his eyes narrowing again. "Aunt Ella and my mother were sisters," Will answered. Mr. Jenkins gave a bark of a laugh. "I don't blame you for not wanting to admit any kinship to that. He and I don't feel the same about the war, but he's been good to me since I've come here to live," Will interrupted, backing down the porch steps. He hated having to defend his uncle to a man who'd lost 2 sons in the war, but he knew it would be wrong to stand by and hear him criticized. "Well, you thank your Aunt Ella and her husband for the rabbit," Mr. Jenkins said, dropping one eyelid in a wink. At the corner of the house, Will almost collided with Mrs. Jenkins. "Here," she said breathlessly, thrusting a basket into his hands. "Here's something to take back to your aunt." Inside, nestled on the folded flour sack, were 4 chicks. Will looked up in surprise. "The Union foragers thought they'd got my whole flock," the old woman explained, "but I'd stuffed all I could into a burlap sack and hung it in the well. It was dark down there, so they never made a sound, and we've had a few eggs now and then. And just yesterday old Buddy hatched out a dozen chicks." She stroked one of them with a gnarled finger. "I think this one's a cockerel." Will couldn't take his eyes off the tiny balls of fluff. "Thank you," he whispered, "thank you." Carefully he carried the basket across the field. "Meg," he called, "come see what I've got." She came running toward him, her bonnet dangling down her back and a huge bouquet of daisies in her hand. Wordlessly he held the basket out to her, and before he knew what had happened, he found himself holding the daisies while she sat with the basket on her lap and a tiny chick cradled in her hands. Separated from the others, it began to peep anxiously. "Come on, Meg, we'd better get them home," urged Will. She slipped the chick back into the basket and stood up, saying, "I'll carry them." Will felt foolish trailing along behind her with the daisies, but then he realized that no one would see him, and Aunt Ella would be pleased when he gave her the flowers, but not as pleased as she'd be to have the start of a new flock of chickens. Until next time.